They told us that marriage is a public act. Divorce is private justice. But when a single wife sues for divorce in a courthouse where once had run the sound of family prayer, privacy perishes in the cold glare of legal reality. I loved him with all the rules I was taught. She breathes softly in the witness stand, and the room bends forward. But rules don't equal truth, she concludes, and a silence settles like paper on wood. This is not a tabloid headline. This is a courtroom. The gavel of the judge, the gentle rustle of legal pads, the camera lenses kept discreetly out of view. We will trace the voice of a single narrator through all the cross-examination, all the held breaths, and all the little gestures that say more than testimony. You'll hear the opening statements that sound like accusations and the closing arguments that feel like confessions. You'll meet the wife who files the papers, the husband whose past returns like an unpaid debt, and the family that must decide whether loyalty survives the facts laid bare. By the end of this hour, one secret will no longer be private, and one question will linger. Did love fail them, or did truth finally set someone free? Stay with me to see how ordinary pain turns public reckoning. And if a line cuts deep, take a moment and ask yourself, what would you do inside that courtroom? If this is grabbing you thus far, give it a like and hang in there to the end. Your opinion of the family may be forever altered. The proceedings started as all paper trails do. Courteous, matter-of-fact, irrevocable. The day was gray, the sort of washed-out sky that makes courthouse glass seem chillier than metal. Folks came in subdued, pushing raindrops off their jackets, carrying folders and coffee cups. But at the center of this courtroom, the air was weighted with nothing to do with the weather. A woman stood behind the petitioner's table, her shoulders set in the way one learns to stand when one has been asked to be strong too long. In her hand was a divorce set of papers, stapled and stamped, a case number in black ink that had come to circumscribe years of life, marriage, memory. The bailiff called the case, and it was as if the room itself waited. Names were spoken into the record. She stood, and the man she had once referred to as her husband followed. He sat at the respondent's table, back straight, face etched into something impassive. For years the public had seen their drama unfold in living rooms and on screens. But this was not an episode. This was the sort of stage where the truth could not be excised in editing. This was the courtroom. The judge pushed his glasses up and looked around the room. The gallery behind them filled with silent spectators. Family, journalists, a few curious locals who had slipped in planning to see history, or scandal, or perhaps both. The gavel fell gently, a touch that sounded more like permission than order for the truth to finally start unraveling. The petitioner's attorney stood first. His tone was even, measured, the pace of a man who understands that each word in a courtroom carries a different weight. He started not with allegations, but with a straightforward remark. This case is not simply about asset division or custody. This is about the right to safety. This is about truth. The words fell with a chill, not a sharp one, but a steady one, and the petitioner's gaze stayed on the wood grain of the table in front of her. The defense attorney answered, her voice warm, nearly defensive. She reminded the court that marriages aren't novels penned in black and white, that they are muddled, layered, and full of misunderstandings that people outside them hardly ever get. She talked of community, of tradition, of ties too readily condemned by those who had never experienced them. Her words ran like a gentle armor around her client, describing him not as a villain, but as a man swept up in the tempest of an impending collapse. The judge heard, face grave, a cautious sustainer of equanimity. But the narrator's gaze, my gaze, is not on the lawyers or judge, but on the little gestures that betray the individuals behind the titles. The hands of the petitioner too tightly clasped in her lap, knuckles white as if suppressing tears. The husband's jaw tensing, when her lawyer uttered the word safety. The slight, barely perceptible nod of a child's head in the gallery, when the defense mentioned family cohesion. These were not legal arguments, but they were facts nonetheless. The opening statements dissolved into silence, and the clerk advanced toward the bench. In his hand was an envelope, folded with a strip of tape, with only this inscription, Exhibit A, to be opened in court. The words were simple, but at that instant, they appeared to have the potency of dynamite. The judge hesitated, his fingers tracing the lines of the envelope, as if considering whether or not to remove a curtain that could open up something more than anyone was ready to encounter. He nodded once, abrupt and unavoidable. The clerk opened the seal. A silence swept the gallery like a wave retreating from the beach. No words were spoken, but all eyes were on that one envelope as if the paper within held the strength to alter what had been done. The judge eased the document out and handed it to the petitioner's attorney. The attorney skimmed it hastily, lips compressing into a line that gave nothing away but intensity. He raised his eyes to the court, voice firmer now, colder. This, he started, cradling the paper in his fingers delicately, is not a piece of property or a balance sheet. This is testimony, sworn, signed and sealed, for the sake of those who lived in fear of speaking until today. The room changed, individuals leaning forward in their benches. The petitioner shut her eyes for an instant, as if preparing for impact. The defense sprang to its feet immediately, objecting before the first word was uttered. They protested hearsay, irrelevance, breach of procedure. The judge heard him out, then nodded his head slightly. The court will permit it, he decided. His gavel struck once, finalizing the decision. The defense attorney sat, eyes slit but quiet. The attorney cleared his throat and read. The words were slow, measured, each one a drop of ink spreading across the page of a tale long suppressed. The gallery was quiet, the sort of quiet that makes you notice every breath, every heartbeat. Even the whine of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade. The husband remained immobile, his face chiseled into calm, but his hands betrayed him. One picked at the table in a light, aggressive rhythm that increased in sharpness as the lawyer went on. The petitioner himself didn't budge. She was immobile, trapped between relief that truth finally had been spoken out loud and fear of what it could mean to go through it again here, in this room, before strangers and the man to whom she once referred as her partner. The judge slouched forward just a little, reading aloud as if he must verify every word for himself. The fingers of the court reporter danced above the keys, capturing history in sweeps and ticks that would be typed out later in black and white transcript, but never quite fit between lines. And then the attorney ceased reading. His gaze rose, eyes sweeping the room, allowing silence to linger for a brief moment longer than was comfortable. He creased the paper in half and set it back on the desk. His tone was deeper when he resumed speaking. This is only the beginning. The judge adjusted, his throat clearing to set the stage for proceeding to the next item of procedure. But the audience recognized that something was different. It wasn't merely a document read into evidence. It was the opening of a door that could never be shut again. The respondent's lawyer sat, the defense attorney rapidly scribbled on a legal pad, and the man at the respondent's table clamped his lips so shut they lost color. In the silence, the narrator's voice runs through the courtroom hadn't blown up. No shouting fit had started. But the blast was present, unseen, a crack running quietly down the base of this family. The gavel fell again, and the judge advanced the proceeding. But for all who were seated in that room, Exhibit A was no longer merely paper. It was a shadow reaching forward into all that would come next. And with that, Session 1 came to a close, not in conclusion, but in suspense. The envelope had been opened, the truth had begun to speak, and everyone in the room knew the next words would hurt only deeper. What was under the seal was not a receipt, nor a contract. It was a memory that somebody had taken an oath to silence. The words written on the page were brief, but they held the power of something experienced. As their lawyer read them out, the court swayed ever so slightly, as if the balance of the room itself had tipped. It was not a lengthy affidavit. It was not filled with legalese, or with paragraphs of explanation. It was a few sentences in ordinary language, signed by a hand that had once been dear to this family. A family insider, a former employee, a person who had witnessed and elected, for years, to be quiet. Until today. The voice of the lawyer slowed as he spoke, each hesitation measured, allowing space between words to hold the tension in place. He described a night of loud voices, of a hard-slammed car door with a dent in it, of a person disappearing into the darkness, with someone calling out to them. He read a sentence that stated, "I thought it was just another fight," but her face looked different that evening. It looked scared. The word scared seemed to hover in the room like smoke. The defense sprang to their feet, objecting once more, labeling it hearsay. Their words came rapidly, near hysteria, as if the rapidity could silence the affidavit itself. The judge deliberated, drumming his pen against the bench. His verdict came calmly, though his eyes were keen. "The court rules this admissible under exception," he decreed. And with that, The affidavit was no longer a sealed envelope. It was proof. It was truth. Or the truth as one person knew it, spoken into the record. The lawyer for the petitioner folded the affidavit and set it on the table delicately, and then he addressed his client. She was called, and she stood slowly, standing as a person with not just her own weight, but with the intangible load of years. She walked to the witness stand. The bailiff moved in, and she lifted her right hand. The oath was spoken, words common to thousands of courtrooms. Truth, whole truth, nothing but the truth. She replied yes, her voice small but resolute. The room leaned forward. All knew this was not merely testimony. This was a reckoning. Her attorney started gently, inquiring why she had petitioned. She stared at her hands before responding. Her tone was even, but her throat constricted around the perimeter of some words. I filed because I could not exist in silence anymore, she stated. I filed because what appeared to be a marriage was not safe for me anymore. The courtroom was quiet. Even the reporters in the gallery, who normally scribbled furiously without stopping, were momentarily frozen. She started talking about her life, not in grand statements, but in things so tiny they cut deeper than any tirade could. She talked about the questions that weren't questions at all. Where are you going? Why didn't you tell me? Who was that on the phone? She talked about the silences at dinner, when children were instructed to hurry and not say a word. She spoke of apologies that arrived so frequently that they became meaningless. He would apologize and for a moment I would think he was sorry, she conceded. But then the same thing would happen once again. And eventually sorry meant it was going to happen again. Her attorney led her through these recollections, not pushing too hard. The defense had one objection on grounds of irrelevance, and the judge waved it aside. And the more she testified, the more those little details fit together into a pattern, one that the jury could not help but notice. Then came the most sensitive question. She was asked whether she had ever been afraid. Her gaze darted to the man across the other table, and then back to her clasped hands. Yes, she whispered, more softly than an accusation, not because of what could occur in a single moment, but because of what continued to occur year after year. Lack of always being safe enough. The words floated there, not accusatory but exhausted. The defense cross-examined swiftly. They pulled out a yearbook entry from years ago, a photograph of her and her husband smiling at a community event. They held it up as if the frozen image could erase what had just been said. You look happy here. The defense attorney pressed. You're smiling. You're standing close. Does this look like fear to you? The photo was placed in front of her. She gazed at it for a long time, her eyes bending just a little. And then she spoke. I was smiling then, she said, her tone containing a thread of defiance across the room. But I wasn't safe. The words broke something open. The gallery moved, a hum running through the benches until the judge rapped his gavel. Order was restored but not silence, for silence is not peace. The defense continued, attempting to trap her in inconsistency. Family vacations, public appearances, interviews in which she had described her husband warmly. She confessed to all of them. She did not retract her former words or her former smiles. Yes, I said those things, she replied. Yes, I smiled. I tried to believe what I was supposed to believe. I did my best to live what I was meant to live. But that does not necessarily mean it was real. A young adult child was summoned next. Theirs was a concise but acute testimony. They spoke of a night in which they had witnessed their mother crying in the garage, her face hidden behind her hands. They had inquired of her if she were okay, and she had smiled while crying and responded that it was only rain. The boy's voice quivered as he recited the line for a second time. She told me it was just rain. The courtroom fell silent once more. The defense had no additional questions. As the petitioner exited the stand, she looked not at her husband but at the jurors. For an instant it was as if she implored them to see not merely the proof, not merely the papers but the years behind their words. She returned to her seat again, her attorney's hand lightly grasping her arm. The gentlest reassurance one could ever hope for in a place where reassurance is not easily had. The defense rearranged papers, collecting themselves ready for a different attack. The judge ordered a brief recess, his gavel ringing once. The gallery rose humming with hushed words, but the atmosphere still lingered with the word she'd spoken loudest, safe. It rang in every aspect of that courtroom, a reminder that this was not merely about dividing a marriage. It was about who had been safe. and who hadn't. When court resumed, the defense again ready to cross-examine, clutching that beaming photograph like a shield. But the jury who heard the affidavit, who watched the mother's quiet determination, who listened as a child described rain that was not rain, had already sensed the change. The courtroom was no longer a place of neutrality. It had been a location where silence had been violated, and where words that were sealed could no longer be kept. The day was left with tension still heavy in the air. No verdict, no conclusion, only the gradual spilling out of things that had lived hidden behind doors too long. The photograph was still on the table, but the final word was hers. I was smiling then. I wasn't safe, and the silence that came after it was greater than any objection ever could have been. When the courtroom resumed from recess, there was a peculiar quiet as if the room itself was holding its breath. The jury returned to their seats, eyes quieter now, measured, as if they were starting to balance something far heavier than mere words. The judge adjusted his robe, scanned over his notes, and nodded for the defense to continue. Eyes turned to the man who had sat in silence during the storm, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. It was his turn. The defense lawyer stood up, adjusting his tie as if to smooth out the stress from the cloth itself. He moved slowly towards his client, the husband, the man who was at the heart of the tale. His tone was tranquil, managed, practically rehearsed. Tell the court your version of the marriage, he started. It was not a request, not even an invitation. It was a well-rehearsed platform. The man stood, adjusting his shoulders. He approached the stand like a man accustomed to being observed. A man who had lived under the gaze of cameras and admirers, where appearances trumped confession. He swore with a firm, unblinking, "I do." Then he started. Initially his words were a description of normalcy. He talked of the early times, the laughter, the common dreams, the late nights mapping out the future of a family. He told of traditions, holidays, children's laughter running through corridors. He even recited words of endearment, saying, "She once told me, you are my forever," allowing the words to resonate, as if they held the value of forgiveness. But as he continued, his story took a slight turn toward blame. He stressed her unhappiness, her increasing remove, her alleged failure to adjust to the family structure. He hardened only slightly when he added, "She desired independence, not harmony, and in a family such as ours, that is poison." The attorney for the petitioner shifted in his chair, jotting down a note. The jurors leaned forward. The room started to sizzle once more, not from yelling, but from the grinding slowness of two narratives crashing into each other. The defense attorney guided him carefully, asking questions that opened doors just enough. "Did you ever feel unsafe with her?" The man nodded, saying, "Yes." Her words could cut like knives. "She had a way of turning small arguments into storms. I began to wonder if she wanted me to fail." The lawyer let the answer sit, not rushing, allowing the impression to settle into the air. Then came the critical question, "Did you ever hurt her? Did you ever strike her?" The man craned forward, his tone intensifying. "Never, I never touched her. Whatever is being said here today is a falsification of the truth." The attorney for the petitioner stood up at once. "Objection, that is not an answer to the question of emotional damage, only physical." The judge overruled, and for a split second, the man's facade cracked. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed, and the jury saw it, small but there. Cross-examination started like a knife gliding silently across the tabletop. The lawyer of the petitioner approached the witness stand, his tone gentler now, almost friendly. "You testified that you never put your hands on her. But can you truthfully say that you never raised your voice?" The man paused, and then agreed, "Of course I raised my voice. Who does not in a marriage?" The attorney nodded slowly, as if in confirmation, but then pushed, "And did you ever yell in front of the children?" This time, the silence was longer. "Once or twice," he admitted. The attorney leaned forward. "Or was it more than once or twice? Because we have testimonies from the children that indicate it was a great many times." "Which is it?" The man said. His words failed him. He grunted, "I don't remember." The jury moved once more. Whispers spread until the judge's gavel struck them down. The attorney's voice became stronger, still calm, but with gravity that extended to the edges of the room. "You talk of unity. You talk of tradition. But fear-founded unity isn't unity at all, is it?" The man responded hastily, "That's your reading." But the attorney didn't bat an eye. He produced the affidavit once more. the one previously admitted into evidence. He read aloud the word afraid, and then asked, "Do you think your wife was lying when she said she was afraid?" The man's lips opened but no words escaped at once. He blinked, jaw clenching once more, before finally uttering, "She misunderstood me. She always misunderstood me." The attorney moved in, his voice dropping so the gap between words became thick. "Or did she know you better than anyone else might?" The man gulped hard. He glanced at the jury, but they did not have soft eyes. They had hard, waiting eyes. The cross-examination proceeded with caution, step by step. Times that he had been tardy, times that he had cancelled family gathering. The attorney mentioned bank statement, mystery withdrawals and with stories money tends to speak long before words. Every shred of evidence was like a slow trickle, not sufficient to sink him at once, but sufficient to wear away his confidence. At one point, the petitioner looked down at her lap, unable to meet his eyes as his denials grew louder. She didn't shake her head. She didn't interrupt. She simply listened, her silence more powerful than any protest could have been. And then the attorney asked the one question that changed everything. "Can you tell us why your oldest child wrote in their diary that they were afraid to talk to you during dinner?" The defense protested wildly, but the judge sustained. The man stuttered, trying to come up with something. Teenagers write things. They embellish. They don't mean what they say. But the jury witnessed the crack widen. It was no longer just a marriage coming apart. It was a family, a generation defined by echoes of words, yelled across rooms and silences imposed at dinner tables. Before the man stepped down from the stand, his shoulders were slumped, his previous confidence lost. He did not look at his wife, the children seated in the gallery, even his own lawyer. He sat back in the table, folding hands tightly, as if clutching something already lost to him. The judge ordered another recess, the second of the day. The crowd rose, stretched, murmured. Journalists wrote furiously, some shaking their heads. And the jurors? They said nothing, but their faces spoke volumes. They had been touched, not by anger, not by yelling, but by the fissures in a man who had spent his life on looking intact. As the bailiff led everyone out, the petitioner sat for a moment longer at her table, her fingers tracing over the affidavit once more. She didn't smile. She didn't weep. She just breathed, her chest slowly filling with air, as if claiming something small but essential. Room to be without terror. The day wasn't done. Testimonies remained. Secrets still lingered unsaid. But for the first time, the equilibrium within the room had tipped. The jury was not yet in possession of the whole tale, and that which was left to be told was the part that no one had ever been brave enough to utter aloud. The courtroom became increasingly quiet with every passing hearing, as if the walls themselves had learned to soak up tension. The storm of testimony in the morning had shaken the air, but something heavier still loomed now. The testimony they whispered about down the halls, the one name that caused both sides to shift in their seats. When court was back in session, the judge took his glasses off and looked down at the list of witnesses. Then he said it out loud, and the sound traveled like a sudden gust through the gallery. A child of the union was being summoned. The bailiff pushed open the side door, and soft footsteps echoed. No longer a child. A young woman, shoulders squared but eyes troubled, striding with the tentative force of one torn between duty and honesty. The petitioner remained immobile, her hands knotted tightly, while the father shifted restlessly, speaking rapidly to his attorney. The young woman held up her right hand, took the oath and sat down in the witness chair. The silence was excruciating for a moment, so absolute it made the buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead sound like thunder. The lawyer for the petitioner moved cautiously, with the voice of one who knew this wasn't about aggression, but about coaxing a memory into the light. "Can you describe to the court what you recall most about growing up in this family?" the attorney asked. The young adult paused, her gaze flicking briefly toward her father, before returning to the attorney. Her voice was firm but quiet. "I remember learning how to watch what I said. I remember knowing what not to say. And I remember my mother saying one time that silence keeps the peace." The words fell like rocks thrown into deep water. Not dramatic, not loud, but impossible to dismiss. The jury shifted forward, pens tapping on notepads, gaze fixed on the witness. The attorney went on, his voice level. "Did you ever feel frightened in your home?" The throat of the young adult constricted, their eyes now blinking more rapidly, but they nodded. "Yes. Afraid of fights, afraid of what would befall me if I did something wrong. afraid of being the cause for all of it to explode. I'd sit in my room and count down the minutes till things quieted again. Their father moved uncomfortably in his chair, his attorney drumming a pen on the table, but no objection was raised. The testimony was too intimate, too fresh. To object to it outright would be to appear to be in denial. The attorney probed softly. You said there were explosions. Can you tell me about one of them? The young adult's breath hesitated. Then they spoke. One evening, I left my homework undone. He screamed so loudly the windows shook. He slammed his fist on the table. My mother attempted to placate him, but he accused her of being weak, that she kept us weak. I will never forget that evening, not because of the yelling, but because afterwards my mother sat in the garage alone in the dark, crying. When I questioned if she was all right, she informed me it was raining. The courtroom halted. The words already whispered once in testimony came again as if in a haunting refrain. Just rain. It was not intended to be repeated. It was memory solid and unchanging, from another set of lips. The lawyer for the father finally stood up, protesting, asserting the memory was fancy, untrustworthy, tainted by time. But the judge ruled against him. The consistency of detail was too convincing to reject. The jury wrote hastily, pens scratching like a chorus of soft affirmation. The lawyer for the petitioner nodded, then posed the question the room had been anticipating. Why do you think your mother filed for divorce? The young woman gazed at her mother, then at the attorney. Her voice cracked now, but the words continued. Because she wanted to live, not breathe, not survive. She wanted to live not being scared of him. The father's chair groaned when he leaned forward, his eyes slanting, his mouth twisting as if he were about to say something. But he didn't. He sat rigid, the words suspended in the air around him, like smoke that he couldn't dissipate. Cross-examination was acerbic, bordering on hostility. The defense lawyer paced before the young adult, launching questions designed to discredit. Isn't it true you used to say on social media that you loved your father? Isn't it true you went on family vacations happily? Isn't it true that just a couple of years ago, you referred to him as a role model? The young woman didn't blink. Yes, I said them, because I wanted to. Because sometimes it was better to pretend. Her voice carried a straightforward candor. The jury couldn't help but hear. The defense became more and more agitated. And isn't it possible your mother worked on your memory, told you how to perceive things? The young adult shook her head, resolutely now. Nobody instructed me how to look at him. I looked at him myself. The silence that followed was oppressive. The defense attorney tightened his lips, realizing every question had only strengthened the witness's determination. He closed the cross-examination curtly, almost slamming the folder shut. The young adult descended slowly, their shoulders still erect, their hands only slightly shaking. They did not meet their father's gaze, but they hesitated for a moment beside their mother's table. Their eyes broke for a moment, and in that brief moment, the whole courtroom held its breath once more. It was not affection. It was not reconciliation. It was acknowledgement. A connection between mother and child, created in years of silent strength. The judge ordered a brief recess, but the gallery hesitated to move immediately. Gossip moved fast, voices hushed and urgent. The reporters wrote furiously, and the jurors remained impassive, thinking their faces now somber, grave. When the gavel came down a second time, summoning the room to order, the defense team for the father was visibly shaken. They had anticipated resistance, denial, perhaps even outrage. They had not anticipated calm, steady testimony from the one voice that could cut both love and fear, the child grown up into truth. As the next witness was ready, the father's face spoke volume. His jaw clenched, his eyes fidgety, his fingers drumming on the table. He seemed more a man prostrate than one defending himself, more a man beset by specters he could not elude. The jury observed it. The gallery observed it, and the petitioner for the first time since entering this courtroom, permitted herself to shut her eyes, briefly, and breathe. The day had not yet finished. More witnesses were waiting, more papers were contained in sealed folders, more truths bulged at the seams of silence, waiting to be uttered. And with each passing hour, the courtroom inched closer to the revelation that had kept itself hidden for too long. The secret that could destroy the last rags of his defense. The courtroom was already thick with words that could not be taken back. But when Session 5 opened, there was a different pressure in the air, the kind that feels on the skin before the storm. The attorney for the petitioner stood up with a new file in his hand. thinner than the others, its cover stamped with only one tab. He walked slowly, setting it on the podium, as though it bore a load too fragile to release. The father looked at it once, his eyes darting with a flick of something new, not anger, not rebellion, but warning. The attorney started slowly. Your Honor, the next item of evidence relates to a situation long hidden. It is not testimony only, but documented, corroborated. The defense promptly objected, charging surprise, non-disclosure, a dozen words to forestall what was to come. But the eyes of the judge grew narrow. The court has seen this in chambers. Objection overruled. The gallery leaned forward in their seats. Pencils were gripped more firmly by reporters. The jury sat up straight. Everyone was aware. Something new was going to emerge. The lawyer smoothed the first sheet. This is an incident report, he stated quietly, filed some close to 15 years ago. It was never brought to court, never entered into public record, sealed at both parties' requests, but it does exist. The man at the defense table leaned forward now, his knuckles against the wood. His lawyer whispered sharply in his ear, but he dismissed him. His face clenched, jaw locked, eyes unblinking. The affidavit was read out. It talked of a winter night, a police call made by a neighbor, who had overheard shouting, things shattering, and the voice of a woman crying. Officers had responded. A report was lodged, but no one was arrested, no one charged, just a statement made and then sealed. The petitioner's eyes were cast down, her fingers slowly twisting in a circle around each other, as if preparing for words she'd never wished to hear spoken. The defense sprang up once more, protesting in fury, unreliable, hearsay, ancient history. But the gavel came down once, firmly. It is admitted. The jury gave its full attention as the lawyer continued reading. The report said the officers observed shattered glass by the door, a knocked-in wall, and the woman's account at the time. He didn't hit me, but I thought he would. It was a solitary sentence, but it throbbed with the sort of truth that does not require elaboration. The defense lawyer started pacing, his voice louder now, attempting to frame the narrative. This was years ago. No charges, no trial, no conviction. How can this be weighed today? But the jury wasn't listening to him anymore. They were gazing at the man, at the way his lips had pressed together so tightly they had blanched, at the way his fingers drummed endlessly against the table, faster, harder. The attorney for the petitioner faced the jury. This isn't about whether there was a conviction. This is about a pattern, about a silence that has stretched over years, about the courage it takes to put words to paper, even when those words are later buried. The judge leaned forward, his eyes weighed down. Proceed. And then the moment everyone had been waiting for. The lawyer summoned a different witness, not a child, not a wife, a neighbor, a gray-haired woman with her hair pulled back in a bun, her hands clasped tightly as she took her oath. She moved with slow steps but sat tenaciously, speaking with crystal clarity. I was the one who called the police that night, she said. I heard it, the shouting, the breaking. I couldn't sit still while it happened. Her eyes didn't blink. She stared directly at the man standing across the room. You might not have hit her that night, but I know what I heard. I know what I saw. The defense pressed to discredit her. You were standing outside the house, weren't you? You didn't look in. How can you testify as to what occurred? The woman nodded serenely. I was standing outside, yes, but fear doesn't require a door to be seen or heard. Fear has a sound. And that night, I heard it. Her words quieted the defense. The jury wrote furiously once more, their pens physically cutting the paper. The man finally broke his stillness. He leaned forward, his voice rising. She doesn't know what she's talking about. She hated me. She always hated me. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. Order, one more outburst, and you'll be held in contempt. The man sat back, breathing hard, his face red, sweat glistening at his temple. The jury saw it. The gallery saw it. The petitioner finally raised her head. She gazed at him in the courtroom, not with hatred, not even anger, but with something colder. Recognition. Recognition of the reality she had been living. The reality now pouring into the light. Inescapable. The neighbor descended, her evidence brief but damning, and the attorney closed the folder slowly, allowing the silence to fall before he spoke once more. This court is not in the position to balance one event in isolation. It is being called upon to balance years. Years of quiet. Years of fear. Years of being told to smile for photographs with bruises on the heart in secret. The jury was quiet, but their eyes spoke volume. They were listening. Listening really. The defense flailed, their plan cracking. They muttered, rustled papers, attempted to reword, but the atmosphere had changed. The man didn't seem so untouchable now. He seemed cornered. The judge ordered a recess for the afternoon. The gallery poured out into the hall, abuzz with murmurs of incident report and 15 years. Journalists sprinted to send in their reports. And in the corner of the room, the man folded into his chair, his eyes fixed on the table, his hands gripped so tightly, his knuckles glowed white. The petitioner slowly exited the room, her children following close behind. She never glanced back at him. Not ever. Because sometimes what is said in silence can speak louder than any confrontation ever could. And even though the trial was far from finished, everyone who sat in that courtroom now knew. The secret was out. The thing hidden in silence for 15 years was breathing again, alive in the official record, etched in ink that could never wear off. The storm had broken, but storms don't end with thunder. They end with what comes after. And that everyone knew was still waiting. When the court resumed from recess, the atmosphere in the room was no longer the same. It was as if the walls had soaked up the evidence, weighted with the burden of remembrance of that which could not be forgotten. The jury returned, their expressions serious, no longer impartial witness, but quiet keepers of what they had heard. The defense attorneys rustled paper, murmuring frantically to their client, but he sat stiff, eyes gazing straight ahead, and not blinking nearly enough. Something had changed inside him, and everyone knew it. The judge banged his gavel once, demanding order. The lawyer for the petitioner stood again, with no file this time, only his words. He let the silence build before he spoke. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are not here to weigh the weight of an isolated night. We are here to weigh the weight of a pattern, a silence that has been demanded, enforced, and endured too long. And silence, Your Honor, is a prison far heavier than walls and bars. The words fell on him, and the man at the defense table let his breath go suddenly, shook his head, lips pursed into a thin line. His attorney reached out to him, whispering, but he swept the hand away. His chest went up and down in jerky bursts, like a caged animal walking his own mind. The defense lawyer stood to rebut, his voice hard, words practiced but spoken too rapid. Members of the jury, you're being deceived. A sealed record, a long outdated report, a neighbor's speculation. This is smoke, not fire. We should not conflate suggestion with evidence. He swung around to face his client, his hand out as if to introduce him like an exhibit. This man isn't perfect, but he's a father, a husband, a provider. He constructed a home, raised kids, gave up for his family. Is that the picture of a monster? But even as he spoke, the jury's gaze did not track with his hand. It tracked with the man himself, whose jaw clenched, whose eyes flicked, whose hands clung to the edge of the chair, as if it could rend at his grasp. The more his lawyer made him out to be gentle, the more the fissures appeared in his silence. The petitioner's attorney went back to the microphone. Not perfect, counsel argued, and yet perfection is not what stands in the dock. Truth is, he took a moment, letting the tension build. We will now present a new witness, someone who has lived inside that house, someone who has looked beyond the walls. The neighbors could only hear through. The name was spoken. A gasp went through the room. It wasn't another wife. It wasn't a neighbor. It was one of the kids. The man sprang up in bed. No, absolutely not. They can't. His words burst out, high, angry, ringing through the courtroom. The judge's gavel crashed down, but his words were louder. You will sit down, now. He sat back in his chair, grumbling, his heaving chest. His attorney was defeated for the first time, head down, unable to keep back the turmoil unraveling beside him. The child grown now, no longer the little shadow, who used to cower behind closed doors, moved towards the stand. Their gait was slow, hesitant but resolute, as though each step was a battle waged and won. The courtroom descended into a silence, so profound, that even the turning of pages was sacrilege. The oath was administered. The witness nodded, hands shaking but eyes firm. Tell us, the lawyer said softly, what you remember. The words stumbled out at first. I remember. Doors closed from the inside. I remember whispering to my sibling, so he wouldn't hear. I remember nights when silence was safer than sleep. Her voice broke, but she didn't pause. I remember my mother saying everything was okay, even when it wasn't. I remember learning that fear had a schedule. The defense blazed. Objection. This is manipulation of the emotion. Vague, uncorroborated. But the judge's gavel struck again. Overruled. The witness will proceed. The child took a deep breath. The evening of that report, I was there. I saw the glass. I saw the hole in the wall. And I saw the look on my mother's face. The look that said we weren't safe. That we never were. The courtroom was stunned. The face of the man reddened, his hand coming down once on the table. The noise echoed. People in the gallery gasped. The judge yelled for order, warning him a second time. But the harm was already caused. The jury jotted quicker, some looking at him, others at the witness. And suddenly, the two portraits, the father the defense had created, and the father the jury had seen through his own blood, collided in the minds of the jury. One was shattering, the other was increasingly impossible to overlook. The witness brushed tears away, voice shaking but clearer now. I don't want to be, but I had to be, because silence is how it keeps happening. And I won't be silent anymore. The courtroom was quiet, except for the soft buzz of the fluorescent light. The man growled, teeth gritted, but nothing more. His silence was no longer strength. It was defeat, pulled taut and fraying. The judge summoned a brief recess, feeling the gravity that hung in the air. The jury was ushered out. The crowd started to disperse. Journalists dashed to the phone, already writing headlines that would cascade across news streams before the hour was up. The man sat crouched, dark eyes, beads of sweat along his temple. His attorney bent closer, talking furiously in a low tone, but the man's hand flashed up, curtailing. His lips formed words, silently, as if he argued with himself. In the corner of the room, the petitioner sat with her children, clasped hands, pale face. She didn't speak, didn't weep, didn't smirk. She just stared at the floor, as if the last 15 years were unraveling at her, thread by thread, knot by knot. And despite the fact that the recess was about to end, every person in that courtroom realized that something basic had changed. A barrier was broken, a quiet had been broken, and in its stead stood the witness of one who had once been too little to be heard, now grown, now irrefutable. The defense would continue to battle, but the jury had witnessed, they had listened, and they could never unlisten. The trial was not now concerned with documents, or closed reports, or guesswork. It was concerned with voices, voices long silent, voices long suppressed, and once a voice has told truth, it cannot be withdrawn into silence. The storm was no longer breaking, it had broken. The recess was over, and when the court the atmosphere was different. It was darker, heavier, like everyone had unconsciously decided that the trial had gone too far. The courtroom was filled to capacity again, mumbling swelling like muffled thunder, until the judge's gavel shut it up. The jury filed in, their faces harder, their notebooks open. This was not routine evidence. Something was waiting to be reckoned. The defense attorney stood up with a face more masked than conviction. His voice was firm, but his hands betrayed him, fluttering with his tie, his cufflink, the edge of the podium. Your Honor, he declared. The defense would call to the stand to defend himself. The words ran like a shock wave the courtroom. Reporters wrote furiously, pens scratching across paper like flint on stone. The wives shifted uncomfortably in their seat, and the man who had remained silent, stone-faced, nigh on defiant, now stood and made his way slowly across the witness stand. Every step was calculated, but there was a quiver beneath, like a building loaded with too much weight. He raised his hand, took the oath, and sank in the chair. The wood groaned under, a sound that resonated more forcefully than it should have. He sat forward, elbows on knees, eyes fixed upon daring them to trust. The defense started gently, coaxing him as a father lead a child safely across a busy road. Tell us about your place and your family. Tell us who you are. In your own words. He cleared his throat. I'm a man who's dedicated his entire life to. I've worked hard. I've sacrificed. I've given everything I had to make my children grow up and give for my wives. Was I perfect? No. No man is. But I was there. I kept the electric. I put food on the table. I constructed a life when nobody else saw it happening. His voice expanded with pride. The cadence of a minister, the rhythm of a man who practiced these lines 1,000 times in front of. The jury heard, pens poised, but and the charges laid. The lawyer asked. His jaw clenched. Lies? Distorted truths, misunderstandings. I never put my hands on anyone the way they are claiming. I never hurt my children. Did I punish them? Yes. Did I fight with my wives? Yes. But abuse? His voice broke. No. Never. This is betrayal. That's what this is. Betrayal masquerading as justice. He sat back, his eyes shining as if he were going to weep, but no tears dropped. His voice was silky, but the room could sense the tension hum beneath it, like a stretched-out violin string. Then the turn. The attorney for the petitioner stood up, cool but biting, each step measured. He moved toward the stand in a silence more intense than language. You claim you never hurt anybody? That's correct. Never raised your voice? Never hit in rage? Never bullied? Never pinned? Never shut up? The man's gaze narrowed, I used the word never the way you're implying. The lawyer slowly nodded, as if awaiting the response. He picked up a solitary piece of paper. Do you know this one? The man leaned forward, straining his eyes. Appears to be a piece of paper. The attorney did not smile. It's a written statement, from your oldest child, 5 years ago. Sealed? Yes. Forgotten? No. Do you want me to read it to you? Or will you? A murmur swept the gallery. The man clenched his lips, his face reddening with anger. That was private. That was taken out of context. They were upset. Kids make things up. The attorney did not blink. He faced the jury and read the words out loud. I am afraid when he is in the room. I am afraid of the footsteps down the hallway. I am afraid of the silence before the yelling. The sentences I had written floated in the air like cloud. Everybody shifted, pens scratching wildly once again. The man came forward, his eyes burning. I never said, did you or did you not? The attorney interrupted. Voice suddenly steel hard, punch a hole in the kitchen wall in front of your kids. The man stopped in his tracks. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. His attorney protested, but the judge overruled. I lost my temper, he muttered. Finally, his voice a low growl. Everybody does. The lawyer's eyes narrowed. And when you lost your temper, where were your children standing? A beat of silence. The man swallowed hard. In the kitchen. Air escaped the room like a shared sigh. The confession was subtle, yet sufficient. The jury wrote more quickly, heads shaking very slightly. The gallery wives looked down, some wiping tears they did not wish to be noticed. The attorney pushed further. So when your child wrote that they were frightened, that they did not feel safe, that they lived in fear of your footsteps, you're asking this jury they were lying? The man's facade broke. His fist shook, slamming once against the arm of the chair. They're distorting everything. I was the only one keeping this family together. Without me, there is nothing. The explosion resonated, ringing off the walls of the courtroom, louder than he meant to make it. The judge's gavel came crashing down. Order? But worse than that was the silence that followed. The jurors' eyes had shifted. They weren't impartial anymore. They weren't fence-sitters. They were witnessing something raw, something naked. The petitioner sat silent, eyes closed, as if she had waited decades for this to unwind. Her child on the witness stand looked down, tears streaming silently down their face. The man caught himself, stood up, attempted to push his hair back, but it was too late. His voice, his facade, his tale, it had all broken in front of the same people who would determine his destiny. And while the cross-examination was far from concluding, the judgment had already started writing itself in the penned silence of the jurors. The precipice now teetered at the brink of his words. One misstep more, and the plunge would be irrevocable. The hush that followed his explosion was oppressive, unyielding. Each set of eyes within that courtroom remained glued to him, not with compassion, not with comprehension, but with a guarded awareness. The facade he had maintained for so long had broken, and the fissures showed on every face. The attorney for the petitioner slowly rearranged his papers, as if allowing the defendant time to brood in his own silence. He then, without increasing the volume of his voice, asked, "You claim you were the sole one keeping this family together. Tell us what is keeping a family together to you." The man stood up, trying to collect the pieces of composure. It means sacrifice. It means discipline. It means sometimes doing something your family doesn't want but doing it anyway, because it's best. Families require structure. They need strength. The lawyer nodded, allowing him to go on. And you gave that? Yes. He spoke quick, too quick. Without me, they wouldn't have come as far as they did. The attorney leaned in closer, voice low, hard. Is keeping a family together equivalent to controlling them? The man's mouth twisted. No, that's not what I said. And yet the lawyer continued, his words slicing through the stillness. We've heard testimony about locked doors, about fear at the sound of your footsteps, about a hole in a wall created in anger. Tell me, sir, does that sound like strength to you? The defendant's jaw hardened. His eyes darted toward the jury, then back at the attorney. I disciplined, I yelled. But so does every father. Don't make it sound like something it isn't. The attorney didn't flinch. Then let us be specific. Did you ever throw objects in anger? There was a hesitation. Once or twice. Did you ever yell so loud your children cried? His fists clutched tighter on the arms of the chair. Yes, but, did you ever strike the wall with your fist when they were around? Yes, he growled. And after all of this, you still expect this jury to believe that they were exaggerating when they told you they were afraid of you? The man's mouth fell open, but no sound emerged. The pens of the jury flew across their pages once more, their eyes fixed on him. The defense lawyer protested, voice shaking with desperation. "Your Honor, this is harassing the witness," he has replied. But the judge rocked her head from side to side. Overruled. The witness will reply. The defendant rocked in his chair, breathing short, each exhalation deeper than the last. At last, in a voice almost inaudible, he grunted. "They misinterpreted. Fear doesn't equal danger. They didn't realize I was doing it for them." The attorney took a step back, allowing the words to linger. Then he addressed the jury. "You heard it. Not once, not twice, but over and over. Actions justified as misunderstandings, fear justified as discipline, beating up people excused as love. Ladies and gentlemen, at what point is excused confession?" The man jerked his head up. "This is a witch hunt. You're all against me because I lived differently, because I dared to choose a path you don't approve of." His voice boomed, his hands thumping the arms of the chair, vibrating the microphone before him. Gasps in the gallery. Reporters leaned forward, taking every word, their pens flying. Wives bowed their heads, one with hands covering her face. The children looked at the floor. The judge banged the gavel. "Control yourself, sir, or I will hold you in contempt." He became quiet, but the damage was done. His anger was no longer concealed. The jury had witnessed it, unadulterated and unrestrained. The mask was now fully dropped, and there was no going back. The attorney stepped forward, one final time, his voice dropping to a whispered aside that traveled the quiet room. "Tell us then, if this is all misunderstanding, if all of this is hyperbole, why are your own children, your own wives, and even your neighbors telling the same fear?" The man's lips formed words, but no sound emerged. He spread his hands wide, then folded them into fists once more, his face flushed with anger, but empty of words. The lawyer backed away, eyes on the jury. No further questions. The quiet that followed was unlike any other. Not heavy. It was done, as if a curtain had fallen. Although the play wasn't finished, the defense lawyer stood up hastily, searching through his papers, trying to regain footing. "Sir," he stuttered, voice shaking but attempting calm, "you love your children, don't you?" "Yes," snapped the man, "more than anything in the world." "And your wives?" "Yes." "You never meant harm." "Of course not." The attorney latched onto the words. "So then the jury will know. Anger is not abuse. Frustration is not cruelty. And mistakes don't make a lifetime of sacrifice." But the words were hollow, suspended in the air of the courtroom, and without substance. The eyes of the jury spoke the truth the defense could no longer manipulate. The judge summoned the next witness, but the defendant lingered in the chair a second too long, holding on to the arms as if he would tumble if he let them go. And in a sense he already had. The trial was hardly over, but the tide had shifted, irretrievable, inescapable. The jury had not just heard the facts, they had witnessed them in the cracks of his voice, in the storm of his anger, in the silence after his own contradictions. And if the courtroom had been like a tempest before, now it was like the eye, still calm only because the worst of it was yet to happen. The courtroom was agitated. When the defendant stepped off of the witness stand, he did not glance at the jury, nor at the gallery, nor even at his wives. As he walked past them, his eyes were glued to the floor, jaw tight, fists buried deep in his pockets, like a man trudging through rain that he could not avoid. The hush that followed him was more deafening than his rants had been, and when he took a seat next to his attorney, the wooden chair groaned under the force of his anger. The judge rapped on her desk. "The prosecution is permitted to call its next witness." All heads in the gallery swiveled simultaneously when the name was spoken. It was not a child this time. It was one of the wives. She stood up slowly, her shaking hands grasping the hem of her coat. She moved to the stand in steps that felt too heavy for her frame, steps that felt like they carried years of unspoken truth. When she sat, she did not glance at him once. Her eyes stayed on the judge, her chin set just slightly, a silent defiance in her calm. The oath was spoken, and her voice cracked as she repeated it, but she spoke every word. "Tell us," the lawyer said gently, "what life was like inside that house." Her lips compressed, wringing back a flood. Then gradually the words emerged. "It was as if we lived with two men. The man that everyone else knew, the smiling dad, the breadwinner, the waving neighbor at the driveway, and then the man we knew when the doors shut. the one whose silence filled the rooms like smoke, whose rage shook the walls. Her words broke, but she composed herself. We reassured ourselves that it was okay, that all marriages had yelling, that all fathers lost their temper. But okay doesn't make you scared to breathe too hard. Okay doesn't instill your kids with the skill of stifling their laughter for fear of triggering him. A silence flooded the room. The jury hung forward, pen suspended but not moving, lest they miss a syllable. The defense attorney stood up. Objection. Emotional speculation. She is staging feelings as facts. But the judge shook her head firmly. Overruled. The witness will proceed. The eyes of the wife sparkled, but tears did not fall. The night he punched the wall. I recall the sound. I recall the children rushing to me. I recall holding them while he breathed hard, glaring at the hole as if he didn't know it was his hand. He didn't hit us, no. But the wall was enough. It said what he could do, what he might do again. The man banged his hand on the defense table. Lies, he bellowed. The judge's gavel snapped. One more of these outbursts, and I will have this courtroom cleared. But the outburst only served to prove her point. The jury had witnessed it, unfiltered and raw. As she descended from the stand, there was no applause, nor any sound at all. Only silence, but not the silence of fear. Rather, the silence of understanding. Then another was called. Another wife. She moved differently, her footsteps fast, her countenance set with years of swallowing up words she could no longer hold back. Steady hands raised hers for the oath, her voice firm, unshakable. What do you want the jury to know? The lawyer asked. Her response sliced like a knife. That love and fear are different. That we were instructed daily to be thankful, to be faithful, to be quiet. And quiet was life. But quiet is also how we remain trapped. She swiveled her head, her eyes focusing on him. He tensed, his jaw working. You told us you kept us together, she went on, her rage shaking in her voice. But you didn't keep us together. You weighted us down, and we shattered ourselves just not to shatter you. Gasps echoed through the gallery. The jury wrote furiously, some shaking their heads, others pursing their lips tightly. The defense attempted to interrupt again. Your Honor, this is only testimony intended to defame. The judge interrupted him. The weight of her words will be decided by the jury. She may proceed. The wife took a deep breath, then spoke closer to the microphone. You wanted to know if fear and danger are alike. I'll show you what danger is like. It's like living on eggshells for 15 years. It's like training your children to read his steps. It's like taking your breath away when he enters the room, hoping today will not be the day he blows. That's danger. And we lived in it each and every day. She struck the air with words like a hammer. The man at the table shook his head furiously, muttering incoherently, his lawyer yanking at his arm to steady him. But the jury was no longer watching him. They were watching her. As she came down, her hands trembling but her back upright, she passed the gallery where her kids were sitting, eyes brimming with tears, and for years she didn't avoid eye contact. The third wife was summoned. She did not move, rose to her feet slowly, as if the weight of her decision lay on her breast. She glanced back once, at him, at the man who had lived with her all those years. His eyes met hers, silently entreating, but she turned and went over to the stand. Her own testimony was more subdued, softer, not as pointed as the others. Her voice shook, but was steady enough to deliver truth. We thought him. We thought the rage was love. The control was care. We thought because it was simpler than the truth. But truth is not safety. And we were never safe. The courtroom fell silent, each occupant suspended between her words and their meaning. When she was done, when she took her seat, the pattern was clear. 3 voices, distinct but tied together by the same thread of fear, silence and survival. The jury hadn't heard stories. She had heard echoes. Echoes too consistent to deny, too piercing to dismiss. The man sat slumped now, his complexion pale, his fists unclenched, but shaking. For the first time, he seemed less the patriarch, less the man in charge, and more the observer of the empire he created crumbling piece by piece. And even though the trial was not concluded yet, the tale belonged to them now, to the voices that had at last shaken off silence. And when the session closed, the question on the air was not if he would be found guilty. It was how much of the truth remained to be revealed. The atmosphere within the courtroom on the last day was like nothing else. It was tense, charged, but strangely still, as if everyone realized that the tale which had been developed here was about to conclude. The jury entered with somber faces, their notebooks now shut, their pens in their pockets. Their eyes contained the weight of 12, who had listened long enough, seen long enough, and heard long enough to last them forever. The judge asked for order. Counsel, you can continue with closing statements. The prosecution stood up first. The lawyer for the petitioner bore no pile of papers this time. No binders, no files, his voice alone. He paced slowly in front of the jury, hesitating as if he wished them to sense the silence before he spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, we have heard from children who once cowered behind closed doors. We have heard from wives who once whispered in quiet. We have listened to neighbors, from reports that are sealed, from walls that bear the scars of fists. And in all this, every word, every voice, every crack, we notice a pattern of fear masquerading as love, a pattern of control, masquerading as protection, a pattern of silence, claimed and endured. He gestured, his finger aimed at the defendant, who remained still, his gaze locked on the table in front of him. He would have you think this was confusion. He would have you think this was training. He would have you think fear is not danger. But fear is danger. Fear is the shadow of all the acts he has denied, and all the truths he has distorted. And fear doesn't lie. He spoke softly, leaning forward as if sharing a secret with them. You have to ask yourselves one question. Do you believe them? Do you believe the voices that were silenced for so long? Or do you believe the man who silenced them? There was silence, and it was heavier than the words. The defense lawyer stood up next, his face pale, his hand shaking slightly as he smoothed out his papers. His voice attempted confidence, but it was shaken under the burden of what had already been said. My client is not perfect. No man is. But perfection doesn't make him guilty. Anger is not abuse. Fear is not evidence. This case has been constructed on emotion, on memories tainted by time and bitterness. He is a father, a husband, a provider. If you convict him for being human, then every man is guilty. But his words lingered faintly in the room. The jury did not jot down notes this time. They did not nod their heads. They simply listened, their faces expressionless, their minds already past the defense. When they finished on both sides, the judge delivered his final instructions. The jury stood up and was escorted out to deliberate. The gallery breathed, but no one said anything. The wives sat side by side, not touching, not whispering, but simply staring at the floor, waiting. The children sat behind them, hands locked in prayer. Minutes ticked by, then hours. Every groan of the courtroom doors made heads swivel, every muffled whisper cut down by expectation. And then finally, the jury came back. The bailiff summoned order. The jurors entered, their faces solemn, their pace measured. The foreperson held a creased piece of paper. The judge's voice was crisp. Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor. The paper was passed across. The judge unfolded it, reading the words on her face before returning it to the foreperson to speak out. The whole courtroom leaned forward, held breaths. The foreperson's voice shook but was audible. We, the jury, find the defendant. A pause that seemed to last an eternity. Guilty. The voice cracked in the hush like thunder. Gasps filled the air. Some sobbed softly. Others closed their eyes and breathed a sigh of relief. Wives hugged each other, years of keeping quiet exploding into sobs that raged in their shoulders. The children wailed, their tears not being of fear this time, but of release. The man sat immobile, his complexion ashen, his jaw hanging open. He did not scream, did not yell, did not pound his fists this time. He only stared straight ahead, as though the ground had given way beneath him, and there was no place left to stand. The judge's gavel came down. Order. The defendant will be held in custody, pending sentencing. The bailiffs closed in, their fingers tight on his shoulders, as he rose to his feet. He looked once, his gaze passing over the wives, the children, the jury, the gallery, but no glance found his. His authority was lost. As he was taken away, his footsteps echoed through the courtroom, the same footsteps that brought fear to his home. But now they held no authority, only conclusion. The gallery breathed as if they had all been holding their breath for decades. The wives got up, hands wrapped around each other, faces smudged with tears, but raised at last. The children hugged them, their soft murmurs saying words of consolation, of survival, of freedom. And in that instant, it wasn't the verdict that counted, it was the voices that were heard, the silence that was broken, the truth that had at last, after all those years, been unleashed. The trial had ended, but the story of healing, of recovery, of living in the absence of fear, was only just beginning. And as the doors of the courtroom closed, the echo of justice lingered, louder than any silence that had come before.